the ladies in church had a baby shower for us, and got lots of cute little pink things. So, and some of the ladies in the church passed down their babies' clothes and equipment to me, so that was really nice, because we didn't have much money to buy anything. We'd have managed somehow. You know, you'd have worn a diaper and a blanket at least.
And then I was brought home immediately into a haunted nursery. It was very cute though, because you made all those Winnie the Pooh cutouts and had them all over the wall. So I had like a Winnie the Pooh theme. And it was really cute.
Well, it wasn't the nursery that was haunted, really.
But it was my old bedroom.
It was the whole house.
Well,
but it wasn't your door that would open by itself. It was my bedroom door, I think.
Oh, really? Did it open and shut?
No, you'd hear the knob turn, and it would open.
While you were in there sleeping?
While I was in the other room and nobody else was home.
And would you find the door open?
Yes, I'd find it open. Sometimes it closed and clicked on its own.
Well, see, I remembered a story. I'm using all my film doing this thing. That's okay. This is important. I remember a story about my Aunt Pat and her husband at the time. Was it Wolfgang? No, John. Who was Wolfgang?
I was her boyfriend before John.
Oh, okay. Pat and John coming over to stay the night and ended up leaving in the middle of the night and refusing to ever stay there again overnight.
Yeah, they saw something there. I never saw anything, but there were those door openings and closings, and when you were small, like a couple of years old, 2, 3 years old, your father was working nights, and you would sleep in bed with me. And I would usually put my back to the door and you between me and the wall, so that, you know, I could tell if you got off the bed. And several times during the night, you sat up in bed screaming and crying and pointing to the doorway behind me and saying, "Mommy, that man scares me." And of course I couldn't see anything, but you saw things. You weren't old enough to have learned that from someplace else.
We didn't have a TV either.
No, we didn't.
So I wasn't exposed to...
Well, your granny and grandma did.
But I wasn't staying over there and watching horror movies until I was quite a bit older.
Well, I hope not. But anyway, then one of the neighbors said to me, "Oh, I see you've moved into the haunted house." And I, "What?" "Yeah, the neighbors around here all call that the haunted house, because everybody who lives there says they think it's haunted." I said, "Oh, great." It's nice to have a warning. By then we lived there and there was no place to go.
Right.
Anyhow.
Well, see, I do remember laying there, and did you leave the hall light on?
I had the bathroom light on, I think, and the door cracked.
See, I remember seeing a man walking past the door. It seemed like he was in a plaid shirt and I don't know what kind of pants, but it seems like I remember seeing him walk by and sometimes look in.
Maybe so.
No.
I never saw it, but you saw something that scared you.
Yeah.
And in your bedroom at night, you'd wake up scared. When you were still in the crib. But, you know, children wake up alone, I thought. Afraid of being alone.
I wonder if Aunt Pat would remember what they saw. She remembers it incident.
She remembers the pages of a book ruffling, opening and ruffling when they were nowhere near it. It was across the room from them. I remember that much. And they watched it in horror and packed up and left. I'm not sure if they saw anything else. I bet she'd remember though.
I ought to write to her, call her, and ask.
Not the kind of thing you forget.
Yeah. Okay, so after my mother and I talked about that, and it had been a topic that's never been far from my mind, the whole issue of the haunted nursery. I always like to tell people I came by ghost hunting quite naturally because I was born into a haunted nursery, which is absolutely true. But as Mom pointed out, the whole house has something going on. But I have vague memories of having company in my nursery even when my mom and dad weren't in there, you know. And I think it was not anything bad. I don't remember anything bad going on in there. But I decided to look into it a little bit further, so I Talked to Mom later about it and contacted my Aunt Pat. And basically, Aunt Pat remembers things that Mom doesn't remember, and Mom remembers things that Aunt Pat doesn't remember. Neither one of them deny that the other person's story isn't, on the mark. It's been 41 years ago. And the memory tends to fade a bit, although you would think they would remember something like that, but whatever. But my Aunt Pat, she was there with her fiance at the time, John, and they were sleeping in separate rooms. I don't know, maybe I was in my parents' room, because I used to sleep on this cedar chest, cedar wood memory hope chest thing at the foot of their bed. I like sleeping on that. It was camping out. So I think I was, as a very young child, I had to be under the age of 4.5, under the age of 4, because we were living in a different house after that. I was probably camping out, and John was in my room, and my Aunt Pat was in the living room, probably sleeping on the couch. And she says that she was laying there with her eyes shut, and John walked into the room and came and stood right by her. And she reached over to touch him, and there was just nothing there. And it startled her pretty badly, because I don't know if she heard footsteps or if she just sensed him coming into the room. But she says, John walked into the room and came and stood beside the couch where I was. And she had her back to the room. And she kind of rolled over and reached over to touch his legs or his body or whatever, and he was not there. And she asked him the next day, and he said no, that he stayed in that bedroom the whole night, and he didn't come in there at all. So, interesting. And it definitely bothered her. And what happened, she's hard to get a hold of on the phone because she's raising some grandchildren. She's got a lot going on. But so I emailed her and asked her, and her email reply, one of them was, ask your mom about the tweezers. So she said, my Aunt Pat said, that Mom called her rather distressed one day, because this was a point at which it was just she and myself. I was a little one, like I said, under the age of 4. And my dad was working a night shift at one of the like oil refineries or the paper plant or something. And we had all these refineries and big nasty things really near us. He was working at one of those. And she went into her room, and there in the middle of the bed was a pair of tweezers. Well, she owned one pair of tweezers. It was, a little bit of a head scratcher, but she's like, oh well. She picked them up and went and put them up into the cabinet. In the bathrooms, we had high cabinets, and there's no way I could have reached them at that age. I remember having to be picked up and put up on the countertop for various things. I couldn't have reached that. And there were no little stools or anything where I could get up in there, so she wouldn't put them away. And then a little while later, she went back in her room, and there was a second pair of tweezers in the middle of her bed. She picked those up and took them to the bathroom. They were a pair of tweezers she'd never purchased, didn't own, never seen them before. Put those in the bathroom. Later on, went back in her room and found a third pair of tweezers in the middle of her bed. And she also took those and put them away. I think there were only 3 pairs of tweezers involved, but she only owned one of the pairs and didn't have them in there to begin with, so mystery tweezers. And the house we moved into next, we also had some problems, and we don't know if it was different issues or if it was the same issue following us to the next house. We don't know, but things were pretty damned hairy, I know, at that first house. I distinctly remember, laying there in my mom's bed at night, because like she said, Dad worked the night shift, and I remember looking at her face and seeing a demonic face like superimposed over her face, and it would change and morph, and I would lay there petrified, unable to move or scream because I was so afraid of what I was seeing. Her face it was like a hologram almost in front of her face, and then it would become her face, and it would grin at me, and the eyes would change and move, and it was it was so horrible. And sometimes I would wake her up screaming and crying and carrying on, And she would try to tell me, well, your eyes play tricks on you in the dark. But I know what I saw, and it happened pretty frequently. And I also remember laying there and seeing behind her, because I remember the hall light being on, but she says it was the bathroom light, which was kind of opposite and over a little bit from her bedroom. It's a very, very small house. It was these little tiny houses that were made for the World War II soldiers to come back and buy cheaply and start their little families. Very small little 2-bedroom house. But I remember seeing a man in the hallway, kind of an older man. And it seems like he was wearing a plaid shirt, but that's like part of this bigger phenomenon of people seeing old men in plaid shirts really often in haunted houses. So I don't know. But I remember seeing him in the hallway, like walking past. And I seem to recall him stopping and looking in at us. And I don't know, maybe he was just looking after us. It could be, but I know that it frightened me pretty badly. So very early in my life, I saw a lot of stuff. And as time went on, I saw less, but I still felt a lot. And now I occasionally hear things. I haven't seen anything that I knew was an apparition anyway. And who knows? Some people say that some of them look so real you never know. Who's to say? But anyway, that's the rest of my story about the first house that I lived in and my haunted nursery. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.